There we are. Hello,
Hello.
Josh. Hear me
Hey,
okay?
hey, Jessica. Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Excellent. Good afternoon. Welcome
Hello.
to Niche Conversations. I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And I'm joined today by Josh MacFadyen. You want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I just heard you mentioned we go way back, and it's true. Back to the University of Saskatchewan. Actually, back to the University of Western Ontario before that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm an associate professor in the Applied Communication, Leadership, and Culture program at the University of Prince Edward Island. I'm trained as an environmental historian, my PhD at the University of Guelph, and then had a number of postdocs and was traveling about for a few years. And one of those was at Western, working with Alan McCachran as the NiCHE postdoctoral fellow. And I think that's when you and I first met,
Mhm.
and you became the social media rep or coordinator.
Editor,
And
yeah.
I gotta say, I teach digital humanities but I'm like underqualified in many ways. But I kind of point to Jessica as the gold standard
Oh,
of
thank you.
social media and digital humanities engagement. You've done an amazing job over the years, and it's just so fun to be part of it. I stepped down when I went to my first job. So I was on the NiCHE executive, and then I stepped down around the time that I took my first tenure track job, which was at Arizona State University,
Mhm.
cross-appointed between history and sustainability there. And um, and then I was fortunate to get an opportunity to apply for a Canada Research Chair at UPEI, which we'd moved around quite a bit at that time, so it was kind of like, oh, I don't think we'll move ever again unless it's, I don't know, like a Canada Research Chair or something, and that'll never happen. So anyway, it's wonderful to get the chance to move back to PEI, and my research focuses on Canada more broadly, but a lot of my current case studies and current projects are kind of Atlantic in focus. So,
Mhm. Awesome. Yeah, and I invited you here today because you've been doing some research on firewood and in central Canada. And last year, around this time, I think it was, you published a blog post with one of your students that kind of highlighted the historical GIS that you were doing to research the supply of firewood in central Canada. And then you recently published an article related to that called These Well-Wooded Towns Supplying Fuel Wood to Central Canadian Urban Markets. So this is what we're going to be talking about today is firewood and energy history and digital stuff. So I thought we'd start off by talking about sources. A lot of people are very interested in how historians figure out what we do. And so what sources do you use to trace firewood supply and movement in central Canada?
yes, firewood was one of those unenumerated products in many ways. There were a few censuses that recorded it, but only from a farmer,
Mhm.
producer, settler's perspective. And we know that many, many more Canadians were involved in the processing and harvesting and selling and consuming of it.
Mhm.
Um, so that was where the kind of questions started for me, and I was reading people like Michael Williams, who argued in his book on Americans and their forests, I believe was one of the titles,
Mhm.
that firewood was one of these most important commodities that nobody ever talked about, and it's partly because it was an everyday commodity, but it was really something that there weren't a lot of records about, and there were a
Mhm.
couple of main assumptions about firewood, and one is that it just didn't travel, right? It didn't go very far, and if you think of William Cronin in his Nature's Metropolis has talked about von Thunen and the theory of these concentric rings and the development of urban centers, and we often forget that the second ring in the sort of theoretical development of a town in the early 20th century, early 19th century was second ring was entirely for firewood.
Mhm.
It was the firewood ring, and then beyond that you could have higher value agricultural products that could travel farther. And the reason for that was that it really needed to be close to the point of consumption, the city.
Mhm.
And so um, when I was looking at some of the early sources, it just didn't seem like there was that much firewood going around in Canada. But that's partly because all we've had so far, including everything that GDP estimates and gross domestic production estimates have been based on, was on those census figures that I mentioned earlier. And so I should shout out to so many people who've kind of helped with those projects over the last few years. Ruth Sandwell was an early advisor, and Alan McCachran as well, but Ben Bradley and Jody Nurse, who should also get a big shout out for editing that special collection that the article just came out in Histoire Sociale. Were really helpful, wonderful editors and the peer reviewers as well. But the students here in the lab, for a lot of, for probably quite a bit of the time, we're thinking, why am I entering numbers of cords of wood? So a cord is a unit of measurement, a volume, 128 cubic feet of wood, and we're entering these from various different sources. And I got one of them who was particularly keen, and he's the one, Nolan Cresson, who co-authored the blog piece with me. And he's also a GIS wizard. I understand we'll chat about what geographic information systems is a little bit. But he did a really great job. And I was like, okay, so trying to explain to him that we're entering this to see the importance of this energy source as it traveled across what distance. Nobody really knows. Is it von Thunen's theory of this ring close to the town, or is it something much farther? And this question intrigued me because historians have always kind of assumed that biomass energy in all of its forms, and we can talk more about how I'm interested in all kinds of biomass, but that it just wasn't transported very far. And so one way to test that, or to look at it, was to use the kind of approach or methods that has been pioneered by a lot of environmental historians in Europe, but the MIFA, or Material and Energy Flow Accounting, a complex term to say, counting how much material and the energy that a lot of those materials produced, calculating how much of it was being used and being transported. So, long story to say, one of the sources that turned out to be particularly useful were the annual reports of the departments, the Canadian federal departments of railways and canals. And so they out of, I argue in the article particularly, because of urban fuel shortages in the mid to late 19th century, there was a lot of pressure on government to say, hey, we're partly subsidizing these railways and canals. Let's have a proper accounting of what they're hauling, what kind of freight they're hauling. And one of the really important commodities was firewood, because people in cities felt they were getting fleeced and having to pay an unnatural price set by monopolist fuel providers. And so that's where the article takes off. It uses those numbers that were in many ways created by public pressure to say, okay, so how much firewood was traveling on railways and canals? And I was surprised that with canals it was a very small amount. There's a lake trade that's different, and that would have to be captured in other ways. But the actual canal trade was surprisingly high in parts, very, very isolated places, though, parts of the Welland Canal bringing, because it tells whether it's going up or down, bringing firewood to actually the U.S. side. And I think a lot of that went to Detroit, to the urban markets in Detroit. And then in the Quebec data, the canals going south to the US were actually seeing some spikes, but there was little spikes here and there. It was really the railroads that had the kind of massive, the much, much larger amounts. And the next question was, okay, so if we know that railways are producing quite a bit of wood, or hauling quite a bit of wood, who's producing it? Are they petty producers, farmers, who are just trying to get $4 or $5 a cord to sell and have it sent to the city, or is it these wood producers, monopolistic or otherwise? And it turns out it's more the latter. From what I could tell, there's this is from more just archival research, that they don't report, the railways don't report who they purchased it from in most cases, at least not in these annual reports. For most cases, it looks like it was being produced by these large jobbers, and these would not have been these wood hawks, they're called in U.S. literature, and these would not be they might be buying from a few farmers, but they're generally kind of heading out to the woods and cutting down large amounts of forest, usually in the Canadian case, way up in the Canadian Shield, and then bringing those down to the cities. So the kind of conclusion that came from that in the Histoire Sociale article was that a lot of the railways themselves, a lot of these small, in many cases they're light gauge, like a narrow gauge railway, they're built not to transport staple commodities in the classic Canadian sense out of the district, but just locally between places like the Canadian Shield and Toronto, or the Shield and Ottawa. And so I focus specifically on those three cities: Ottawa, Toronto, and a bit about Kingston too, and the fuel markets that those towns were generating. But that GIS was super helpful when it came to doing that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that next. So historical geographic information systems, or historical GIS. Both of us have some training in it. I would say I have some training in it. You were good at it. But let's talk about time mapping or temporal GIS. Like, what is it, and how did you use it in this project to visualize this information you were just talking about?
Yeah, so geographic information systems are the computerized ways to store and display and analyze information about the world, about the physical Earth. And the kind of tension over the years has been that for other disciplines beyond, in many ways, physical geography, or planning, or many of the earth sciences that really just want to know where something is at a certain point in time and want to know with a lot of precision where that is. GIS was developing wonderfully over the years, 80s and 90s, to develop very highly precise ways of doing that. And if you get into the history of cartography, you can see maybe this geographic information science, the other GIS, geographic information science, is really hitting this kind of pinnacle in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where GIS is doing all this fantastic, making this work available to almost anyone who can afford one of the proprietary software licenses, ArcGIS, or if they're getting into open source, they can try options like QGIS, and those are becoming more and more available, more and more powerful. That you can run them on personal computers, run them on tablets even. But the people who were kind of left out in that were people who wanted to look at not just space but time. And so historians always struggled with the fact that GIS was meant for kind of one point in time, and what about data can not just have locational attributes but temporal attributes. So temporal GIS is a way to map things as they change over time, and it becomes very complicated if you're looking at a boundary or a polygon that's the boundary of a place, because those boundaries changed, as we know in history, constantly. And if you're using these boundaries for display, then it can be really tricky to use GIS to show change over time, and as you're trying to display that. But basically, it's a visualization tool. It's a data viz tool. From my use of it, there are ways to use GIS much more analytically, where you're measuring and tracing that. In this article, it's still pretty descriptive in the sense that, and the article still has pretty static pages, from what I can tell here, so that they're not actually moving, but I show 6 maps in a series. And those maps are showing the railway freight being hauled, dedicated specifically to firewood, and it's from cities way out into each part of the country where the rail lines went at that time, right? So each year is specific, and this is thanks to the tremendous work done by Chris Andrea, and Marcel Fortin shared it with me. But like these are really complex lines. So we're not talking polygons at this point, but lines, and each line represents one of the railways. But as every year changes, as every year goes on, they expand. And so when I wanted to do, say, the map of 1873, I needed to get the shapes, the lines in this case, that were that only existed in 1873 would be, you know, kind of unrealistic, I suppose, to show the future or the current rail lines. And in many cases, rail lines disappear, and that does happen with some of these light gauge rail lines, like for instance some of the Credit Valley rail lines and some of the Toronto Grey and Bruce rail lines that run out of Toronto are now walking trails or even have been turned over to other uses. So we wanted to know where did the railway exist at that time, which company ran it, because we're trying to match it back to those sources. So we know which companies are reporting in these annual sources, and then we're going to show the data in that map for 1873. But then you push play, and this is where the sort of animated data viz part of it comes in. And that's what brings us kind of up to the last time point, which is 1904. And at that point, the data become really messy, and partly because, as you know, the history of energy transitions, people were moving away from biomass and moving toward fossil fuels at an alarming rate. And suddenly firewood is a little bit less important. There's a little bit less public pressure to understand how much of it's going in which direction. So it gets lumped in then with other forest products. And I included that in a chart in the article to show that after 1904, it goes up, and it goes up quickly, but it's actually being combined with pulpwood, and pulpwood is, you know, just exploding in the early 20th century in Canada. And so at that point, it's that my analysis ends, because I can't track and follow the firewood. But in the period in between, in that late 19th century, we see it coming, just kind of see it, pretty large amounts of it coming from the Shield and from other areas into the cities. And I found across the border that we're shipping it down to the US as well. So anyway, that's Temporal GIS, just helps to visualize that.
Yeah. And if people check out the blog post from last year, you have a YouTube video that kind of shows the sequence of it. That's helpful. And you can really see, how the analyses of it, like what you can get from it. And so I suggest people check that out. So, but
I think I've promised to do another one too for NiCHE for the sometime late, I guess toward the end of this year, that'll show the updated version of that. So,
very
well,
good.
as you know, these things take so long to finish, these projects, and then in the time that it was taking me to edit the article, we actually added a few more years, which adds just a little more granularity to the story.
Yeah, I think one of the downsides of GIS is how much time it takes. And one of the reasons I found myself move away from it, I just didn't have the time to do it. And also like move on with my life. But I love the work that you've done with this, and I think it's really helpful. And firewood is I'm very attracted to this research on firewood, and I think it's because I have like growing up, firewood was central to my existence, but in a very different way. Like firewood was key to my parents' business because they were cabin owners, and they were providing a tourist experience, and kind of like this idea that firewood kind of, becomes the fuel of tourism, like forest tourism. Anyways, that's an article for someone or myself at some point, that transition. But just thinking about firewood and thinking about a time when firewood was so much more central to our lives, and not just about, this like rustic experience, right? So as you state in the introduction of your article, biomass such as firewood has largely been ignored by many historians in North America, both in the US and Canada. So I wonder, you kind of hinted at the beginning, but I thought maybe we talk a bit more about why that is and why historians should be paying more attention to it.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say you think it's interesting because you think about it, maybe especially this time of year, because you live in the coldest place on earth. It's a cold city, and this time of year, people start thinking about wood more, and so it's definitely a seasonal item of
Yeah.
interest. But yeah, I think people are paying a little bit more attention to it now, and tackling this problem that Williams mentioned, that it's a really important commodity that everybody was involved in some way in for centuries, that we don't have that much information about. So in small ways, I'm
Mhm.
adding chapter by chapter to that. And but there are, lots of new studies coming out. Roland Enos just wrote a book from a more scientific side of things, but it's a grand kind of approach called "The Age of Wood," sort of a history of our most useful material or something. And saying that for most of world history, all of the you look at the material flows that we see today, it's mostly concrete, right? Our largest flow is concrete, and
Mhm.
our next, and then we have our other minerals and fossil fuels moving around. But for most of humanity's past, it was biomass. It was kind of wood and other types of plant energy,
Mhm.
and a lot of that is fodder for animals, which we'll talk about some other day. But so I like how he kind of suggests that if we take this seriously, we're going to promote or help develop a lignocentric view of human history, so a
Mm.
wood-centric view of our existence. And so it's kind of, and I think this may have gone a little bit too far, but I think it's something that we could stand to learn a lot more about.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so that's the goal of this. Is it's part of my larger project now on an environmental history of biomass energy, um, and just trying to fill in those gaps of what we don't know at this point about how many Canadians were involved in it, what drove them, and I think, as you said, the cultural values connected to it as well.
Mhm.
I'm beginning to learn how important it was in Quebec history, in particular, and I'm trying to brush up on my French enough to do a decent job with the sources. But if you follow our farm profiles
Mm.
on my website at UPEI, the GeoLab, upei.ca/GeoLab, and click on farm profiles, you'll see that next week the farmer, quote unquote, that we're talking about is actually a huge wood producer, and
Oh.
he has a small farm, but he's in the eastern townships of Quebec, and it just produces tens of thousands of cords, and clearly it's going to cities, not to kind of nearby farmers. It's just way too much. So we're looking at kind of where those went, what are the cultural values and attitudes toward it, um, and in an urban context, one of the examples I mentioned is that when people ordered fuel, they ordered very complex orders of fuel. They thought about energy in different ways than we do today. And one of the orders, is like this many tons of this kind of coal and that many tons of
Mhm.
this kind of coal. But then two different types of wood were being ordered, and you're like, why? Why would they? And that's partly because, well, they had a hearth, like a larger fireplace to burn wood in, but then a cook stove or a kitchen stove that needed different kinds of wood in smaller amounts. So
Mhm.
people were very much prejudiced toward wood. If you think of the Dickensian histories of coal, people didn't want to cook on coal, thought it was dirty,
Mm.
and this kind of soot and pollution from coal that was immediately evident. People thought that wood was a preferable fuel in many situations, not all. But so anyway, that's why I think wood is such an interesting topic to study.
Yeah, very cool. Well, this is a lot of information, and yeah, I encourage everyone to check out that blog post and the journal article. We're going to be having in the next couple of days, I think we'll be having a highlight of that entire issue on our website. So
Sweet.
there'll be a link to Josh's article as well as the other articles in the special issue of Histoire Sociale.
Yeah, they
And
just came out on Project Muse, so
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
little more accessible now.
yeah, exactly. So I encourage everyone to keep an eye out for that or just head over to the website and check it out. But thank you so much for joining me today, Josh. This is great.
Thank you. You're doing awesome work as usual. So, and go donate to NiCHE, right?
Yeah, donate to our fundraising campaign right now. On. Yeah, cool. Okay, take care. Bye.
All right. See ya.